the last day of Jesus' life before he is crucified. So we're going to be looking at several events, several stories that happened starting kind of the evening before and then through his arrest, and then the trials that he faces the overnight and the morning of the crucifixion. And then we'll pick up with whatever we don't get done today, and then the story of the crucifixion itself on Wednesday, and then be able to finish up with the resurrection appearances on Friday. So today we are looking at the events of the last kind of day, that evening before, and most of the kind of initial part of that revolves around an Old Testament event called the Passover. If you haven't had Old Testament yet, or you're not super familiar with Passover, to give you kind of the summary, the Passover was the big event in the Old Testament through which God delivered the people of Israel, the descendants of Israel, the Hebrews, out of slavery in Egypt, and began at least the process of leading to the promised land, and to give them the law and all of the things that mark them as God's people. And it starts with the young boy Moses. Pharaoh gives the order when he sees the Hebrew population swelling and getting to be so large. He gives the order for all the Hebrew boys under the age of 2 to be killed. And Moses' mother puts him in a basket and floats him down the river instead of killing him or throwing him in the water directly. And down the river a little ways, the daughter of Pharaoh finds him and adopts him. And so Moses, ironically, because of Pharaoh's order to kill all the Hebrew boys, Moses actually ends up being adopted and raised in Pharaoh's family. And this, I see you squinting and trying to figure out where I'm talking about, probably the Passover. So we're leading up to the event that causes the Passover. And so Moses is raised in Pharaoh's household, and later, when he grows up, there's an event where he sees an Egyptian slave master beating a Hebrew slave and beating him violently. And Moses reacts and kills the slave master, the slave driver, and hides the body, but he's found out, and so he flees and runs away from Egypt to keep from being prosecuted or being killed for having murdered an Egyptian slave driver. And while he is out in the wilderness, away from Egypt, several years later, God calls him to come back to Egypt and to lead the Hebrews out of captivity and out of slavery. And God tells him several things to do, gives him the ability to perform certain signs or miracles, and then gives him directions on what to do as God sends 10 plagues on the Egyptians. And each of the plagues is another kind of effort or push to get Pharaoh to release the slaves, to release the Hebrews and let them leave. And after each one, either Pharaoh flatly refuses, or he promises that he will, and then he goes back on his word as soon as the plague is over and won't do it. And so there are nine plagues play out, and Pharaoh refuses to release the Hebrews. And then God tells Moses that the 10th plague is coming, and that the 10th plague, the final plague, is going to be the death of the firstborn male of every womb in Egypt. And so the firstborn son of every house in Egypt, of every household, of every family, is going to die. And not only the firstborn son of every household, but the firstborn male of every animal, of all of the livestock and all of the animals in Egypt. The firstborn child or son or male of even the domesticated animals are all going to die. And so that's what's going to happen. That's the final plague, and it's coming. But God tells Moses that if the people will perform this act, this ritual, then death will pass over their household. And so God tells Moses to tell the people, each family, to slaughter a lamb or a young goat, and to take the blood from the slaughtered animal and paint it on the doorposts. So on the top post, the lintel over the door, and then the 2 side posts of the door. And so to paint the doorposts with blood, and then to prepare a meal using that lamb and some other things to be ready to go the next day. And when death comes through Egypt, every household with the door on the blood on the doorposts will be passed over, and death won't visit that house. And this, by the way, was not only for all of the people of Israel, or the descendants of Israel, for all the Hebrew slaves. Anyone Even the Pharaoh could have painted his door and family been fine. And so anyone that paints the blood on the doorpost will be passed over, and death won't visit their family. And of course, the Hebrews do it, and almost all of the Egyptians don't, because they don't listen to the warning. But the option was there even for the Egyptians. And so they paint the doorpost with the blood, and then God tells them to take the animal and to cook it, to roast it over the fire. And to do it, the way that they do it is in haste. That they do as the minimal preparation to it that they can, and still cook it, and including leaving all the internal organs, which is not what you normally want to do when you're roasting an animal. Like if you roast a chicken in the oven, please don't leave the internal organs inside of it. It will be nasty, because there's stuff in there that's not normally edible. We don't normally eat it directly. So take that stuff out. But God tells them to leave the organs in it and roast it over the fire so that it will be done quickly. And then tells them to bake bread, but to bake it without rising first, without putting in any yeast, and without allowing it time to rise overnight, because they want it to be done quickly. And so the meal is flat bread, some herbs that could be quickly gathered that were bitter herbs, and this lamb cooked without removing all of its organs. And so they eat that overnight, and they're ready to go the next morning. And sure enough, death has passed through Egypt. The firstborn son of every household is dead, including Pharaoh's own household. And finally, he lets the people go. And this event, the Passover, when God visits death on all of Egypt to secure their freedom and passes over every house that was obedient to this command, this event is celebrated each year from this point on in Israel. And so they celebrate it, and the date for the celebration is the 15th day of the first month of the year in the Hebrew calendar. And so they celebrate it every year, and this is one of the two festivals or two celebrations in Jerusalem that all Jewish men are required to return to Jerusalem to celebrate. And of course, they normally bring their families because there's a big family meal and celebration around it. And so when Jesus calls his disciples together, they're in Jerusalem for the Passover celebration, for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, as it's sometimes called, or the days leading up to it are sometimes called. They're in Jerusalem for this, and so Jesus tells his disciples to go and prepare the Passover meal and to set it up. And Jesus uses the Passover meal and several things in the Passover meal as kind of parables or metaphors for himself and what's about to happen to him. And we'll see a lot of those connections over the next two lectures, today and Wednesday. And so he leads his disciples in, and he tells his disciples to go ahead of him in the city, and there'll be a man there waiting for them who has a room ready. They just have to ask for it. And sure enough, they go in, they find this man. He has a room ready for them, and they go up and they start to prepare the meal. They set it all up, get everything that's necessary for the meal, and then he and his disciples gather around the meal that evening, get around the table to eat. And there are, all four Gospels contain an account of this Passover meal. The first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, contain an account that includes the Lord's Supper, the preview of the Lord's Supper, the events that lead to the establishment of the Lord's Supper, including the disciples, Jesus serving various elements of the meal to them, and how they'll take on new significance in the church later. And then, so all the Synoptic Gospels contain these elements that become the Lord's Supper. And then John's Gospel contains also some other stories. It doesn't contain the Lord's Supper elements, but does contain these other things that happened that evening, the washing of the feet, and then several chapters of Jesus comforting his disciples and then praying over them, praying for them. And then also all four Gospels contain various slightly different wordings of Jesus' prediction that he is going to be betrayed by one of his disciples and that Simon Peter would deny him. And so we'll look at those as we're passing through. And so Jesus, for the Synoptic Gospels, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 27, verses 13 through 35 for the kind of main outline. Really, it doesn't matter which of the Synoptic Gospels you look at for this. They're very similarly worded. There's very little difference between the three Synoptic Gospels, at least for the details that we're going to look at for this. And so Jesus comes with his disciples. They're gathered around the table. They're reclining around the table to eat the meal. And Jesus begins to tell them how excited or how much he has looked forward to sharing this meal with them and showing them what he's going to show them on this night. And then he pauses and tells them that one of them is going to betray him. One of his own disciples is going to betray him, and he uses this kind of odd image, and he says that one of those who has dipped his hand in the bowl with me is going to betray me. And there were the bowl would have been kind of a bowl of olive oil and some spices and maybe some vinegar, and they would dip the bread in it, and it was kind of an extra seasoning and made the bread taste better. If you've anybody been to the Olive Pit in Paris? It's Italian restaurant nearby. They kind of do a similar thing without the vinegar. It's just they put a bowl or a shallow plate of olive oil on your table, and then shake some seasoning on it, and then you dip your bread in that, and it tastes better. And so that's kind of what he has in mind. There's this kind of common bowl that everybody's dipping their hands in, to dipping their bread in and eating it. And so he says, one of those who has dipped his hand in the bowl with me will betray me. So he's saying, one of my closest companions, one of those that is here in this room, will betray me to the leaders, the religious leaders. And so the disciples start looking around and saying, is it me? Surely not me. I'm not going to betray you. Surely I wouldn't be the one. And of course, Judas Iscariot has already arranged to betray Jesus. He's already set up with the leaders of the temple and already been paid to betray Jesus. And so you can imagine Judas sitting there at the table with the 30 silver coins hidden up in his robe, in a fold of his robe, listening to Jesus say, somebody's going to betray me tonight. And knowing that it's him. And then eventually he says, is it me? Because everybody else is asking, is it me, is it me, is it me? And so Jesus replies back and says, you say so. And so Jesus doesn't immediately out Judas at the table, but it's pretty clear that Jesus knows who it's going to be, knows what's going on. And so then, as they continue in the meal, Jesus takes the various elements of the meal and uses them to establish what we now in the church call the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist or the Mass, Holy Communion, depending on what tradition you're from. Any or all of those words may have been used at some point. They're all referring to the same thing, where we take bread and wine or juice and use it as elements or representations of Jesus' body and blood. And the reason for that is what Jesus does with these elements when he is serving the meal. And on one moment in the meal, Jesus takes some of the flat bread, the non-risen, unleavened bread, and breaks it and hands it out to his disciples and tells them, take this and eat it, it is my body. And one of the other Gospels has an add to it, whenever you do it in remembrance of me. And so he's using this bread as a kind of physical parable or representation of his body, and he breaks it as he serves it, as you would if you're sharing one loaf among multiple people. But the breaking of that bread ends up being a kind of a parable that foretells the brokenness of his body, that his body is going to be broken. He's going to be tortured and killed over the next day. And then a little later in the meal, there's several points where wine or a toast, something like a toast, is given during this Passover celebration. Now it's called a Seder celebration. But during this meal, the wine is passed several times around. In one of those occasions, Jesus takes the cup full of wine, and it's one bowl that they're all going to drink from, and he passes it around to them, and he says, "Drink from this, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." And so they all drink from the cup, and Jesus uses that as another kind of physical parable of his death. That this wine in the bowl, the wine in the cup, represents his blood, which is about to be poured out for all people, for the forgiveness of sins. And so he uses the breaking of the bread and the sharing of the wine to represent what's going to happen to his body, to his death over the next day. His body broken, his blood shed. And so that's the two elements that are still used today in most churches to celebrate communion, Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, Mass, depending on what tradition you're from. And churches have slightly different beliefs about what happens in communion or what exactly it represents, but we all pretty much agree the bread is Jesus' broken body, the blood is Jesus' shed blood, and we should all do it, at least from time to time. It's one of the hallmarks of the church. There can be lots of variance in the belief of exactly what's happening, but those basic elements are shared by all Christian churches. And so Jesus gives them that, and then they leave. The Synoptic Gospels record them leaving, and they all sing a song. They sing a hymn or song as they're leaving and going out to the Mount of Olives, where they're going to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus is going to pray. But before we get there, that is basically the abbreviated account of what happens in the Synoptic Gospels. John, though, records a couple of other things that happen that the other Gospels don't record. And so one of them, first of all, when the disciples gather and they get to the room, they get to the upper room and are ready to share the meal, Jesus looks around and sees all of his disciples there, and he stands up and starts stripping off his outer clothes and leaves himself in kind of just his underclothes, or his kind of base garment. And then he goes over and grabs a towel and wraps it around his waist, and then grabs a basin of water and comes around and starts washing all of his disciples' feet. And this is remarkable because Jesus is the kind of center point of the story. He's the master, he's the teacher. He's identified himself, and his disciples have identified him as the Messiah. He's the most important person in the room, right? And yet he's going around and washing everyone's feet, which at the time was usually the job reserved for the lowest ranking member of the household, or the lowest ranking slave in the household. Because as we talked about before in dealing with the miracle of the wedding at Cana, when Jesus turns water into wine, people's feet were nasty, right? They walked outside in sandals most of the time. Everywhere they went, they were in sandals. And the roads, most of them weren't paved, and if they were, it was not like we think of pavement. It wasn't with material that could never come out, and so there was dust and dirt on the roads that would get into your feet, or get into your sandals and shoes. And then there were also animals being transported and moved around on the roads, and animals leave things behind when they travel on roads. Just look at any Christmas parade, the leavings behind any animals in a Christmas parade, and you'll see animals don't walk the roads cleanly. So animal feces is on the road. Several different species of animal feces is on the road. And people didn't have full sanitation like we're used to now. You didn't flush your waste down a toilet and it goes somewhere where you never have to see it again. Often people had to use the bathroom either at kind of an outhouse facility or into a basin, and then empty that out outside later. And often some of that ended up in the roads. It worked its way around to the roadways. And so animal and human waste was out in the roads. And you walked around on those roads, and that stuff ended up inside your sandals, your open shoes. And so people's feet got really nasty. And so nobody wanted the job of washing anybody's feet. And that may have been very well how Jesus ended up, as washing everyone's feet. As he comes in, and the disciples all start kind of, trying to get away from the water pot as fast as possible, or find something else interesting to do in the room as soon as they come in, so that they don't get stuck doing that, or start arguing over who it is that has to wash one another's feet. And so Jesus goes over and strips himself down and picks up the water basin and starts doing the nasty job that is normally the lowest ranking person in the room's job. And yet he is the Messiah, the teacher, the master. And when he starts to wash their feet, when he starts to do this, they start to object, and they really strongly respond. In fact, Peter says, "Lord, you can't wash my feet. You can't do this. You can't kneel down and wash my feet." And Jesus tells him, if I don't wash your feet, then you have no part with me. You've got nothing, you can't have anything to do with me. And so Peter says, well, then don't just wash my feet, wash all of me, wash my whole body. And Jesus says, kind of, calm down, Peter. If you've taken a bath, you don't have to bathe your entire body, you just need to wash your feet. And so he says, I'm going to wash your feet, Peter. And so he washes all of their feet, and when he's done, he goes back, he puts the bowl down, he takes the towel off, he puts his outer clothes back on, and then he comes back and sits down at the table, and he says, do you realize what I've done for you? Like, do you realize what I'm showing you, what I've done for you here? And so he says, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, because I am. I am your teacher and Lord. And now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent them. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. And so basically, Jesus has physically enacted his teaching that whoever would be first or greatest among you must be the servant or the slave of all. And so Jesus, the Messiah, the greatest possible person, has turned his disciples and taken the job that the least slave would normally do. And his point, or the part of that teaching, part of what Jesus is emphasizing through that, is that his disciples should never see position or rank or any kind of authority, or if they find themselves leading others, they should never see that as a position of privilege from which they don't have to do the dirty jobs or to do the things that are, undesirable. That when someone holds a position of authority, or if someone is a leader, if anybody is in the first position, then they must use that. They must always use their position in order to serve those that they lead. And so any leader must use leadership to serve and must be the servant of all. And that's a pretty radically different way of understanding leadership than most people use. Even this teaching being here for 2,000 years, as having had it now for 2,000 years, we still can't get a strong cast of leaders that all believe this and work this way, right? We can't get people that want to use their positions, if they get into positions of authority, that consistently want to use those positions for the good of those under them rather than to advance themselves in their own interest. And so Jesus washes his disciples' feet and tells them, I've done this for you as an example, you must imitate it. And then he spends the next several chapters of John, starting with John chapter 14, verse 1, and going all the way through the end of chapter 14, Jesus is speaking and saying things in order to comfort his disciples because of what's coming up, what's about to happen to him. And then in the final chapter, that chapter 17, he is praying for his disciples. He's praying over them and praying for them. And so he spends 3 chapters trying to comfort them and assure them about what's coming, and then 1 chapter praying over them. And he begins by saying, chapter 14, verse 1 says, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me so that you may be where I am. And you know the way to the place that I'm going. And so Jesus basically is telling them, I'm about to have to leave. I'm not going to be with you for much longer. And so he knows that he's going to die, and then after dying, he's going to rise from the dead. And then after a period after rising from the dead, he's going to ascend and not be here with them anymore. And so he's starting to try to prepare them for what's going to happen the next day when he dies, and then later when he leaves them, physically at least, leaves them more permanently. And so he tries to reassure them, basically, if you believe in God, you can also believe in me. If you trust God, you can also trust in me. And that what I'm doing is for your good. And my Father's house has plenty of room for you and for all my followers, and I'm going to go there and prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, then I'll come back to take you home. And so then he says, you know the way. You know how to get where I'm going. You know the way to where I'm going. And it's like, you just said you're going to your Father's house. We don't know how to get there. We don't know where you're going, much less how to get there. And so Thomas stands up and says basically that. He says, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? And then Jesus responds with one of his better known phrases, one of the things that Jesus says that's very recognizable, though most people don't know that it comes in this context of him trying to comfort his disciples. And so Thomas says, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? And Jesus responds and says, I am the way, the truth, and the light. No one comes to the Father except through me. And so he went to the question, we don't know the way. How can we know the way to where you're going? Jesus answers, I am that way. If you know me, then you know the way. If you know me, then you know the way to get there. And if you know me, you know my Father as well. And so then one of the other disciples, Philip, stands up and says, Lord, show us the Father. Let us see the Father. And Jesus replies back and says, you've seen me. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? And so Jesus, again, he claims to be equal with the Father. He is divine. He is God's Son. And he reassures them of this and reminds them of this, that he is God's son, that he and the Father are one, as part of his attempt to reassure them that everything will be okay despite what they're about to see, despite what's about to happen, that all of this is still under control. And then he tells them, he teaches them that if they love him, they should follow his commandments. If they care about him, if they love him, if they love him as their teacher and their master, then they should follow his commands no matter what happens. And that as part of that, he gives them this new command that is not really a new command. He says, my command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay one's life down for their friends. For you are my friends if you do what I command. And so he says, love one another. That is my command to you. Love one another and follow my commands. If you love me, follow my commands. Love each other. And then he warns them that persecution is going to come to them. People will mistreat them and hate them because of their relationship with him, and warns them that that's coming. And then finally, in the last chapter in this sequence, in chapter 17, Jesus begins to pray. And first he prays for himself, that God will glorify him through what's about to happen, and that God will use it, and that God will bring him glory through it. And then he spends most of the chapter praying for his disciples, that God will preserve them and protect them and bring them through, and that basically just praying for them through what's about to happen to him. And then after that, that's where John ends the upper room experience and has them leave to go to the Garden of Gethsemane, or go out to the Mount of Olives. And that brings us to the Garden of Gethsemane. And if you come out of Jerusalem, you go down through this valley. It's called the Kidron Valley next to Jerusalem, and you come back up the mount on the other side. That's the Mount of Olives. And about halfway up, there is this olive grove, and there's still part of it there today. It's smaller than it used to be, almost certainly. But there's an olive grove there that was called the Garden of Gethsemane. It was called Gethsemane. And actually, if you go there today, it's much smaller, and it's right beside what's called the Church of All Nations. And so you may have to try to find it, because when my wife and I were there, we couldn't find anybody. Most people didn't recognize the name Gethsemane, but it's the olive grove right next to the Church of All Nations. And so you go there. But if you go there today, because of the lifespan of olive trees, there are probably some trees in that orchard that were there when Jesus was praying. So that 2,000 years ago, those same trees, some of those same trees are still there and still alive and still producing olives. Because if olive trees can live a very long time, especially if they're tended and you're grafting in new shoots into the old wood, they kind of revitalize, and the tree can live for thousands of years. And so it's very possible that some of the trees in the Garden of Gethsemane are that old. They're old enough that Jesus was there praying under those same leaves, those same branches. So Jesus takes his disciples, and he has his disciples kind of stop, and they settle in, and then he takes Peter and James and John and goes a little further into the garden, a little further into the olive orchard, and he asks them to sit and wait with him and to pray with him while he goes a little further along and prays alone. And so he wants Peter and James and John to stay there and stay awake and pray with him, because he realizes that he is suffering anguish. In fact, Mark, we're going to look at Mark's version of this as kind of the base, and then we'll add in some details from Luke, and then add in some details from Luke's version. But Mark chapter 14, verses 32 through 42 have the Garden of Gethsemane scene. And so he takes Peter and James and John with him, and then says he began to be deeply distressed and troubled, and he says to his disciples, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." And so he is so anxious and so torn up over what he knows is about to happen to him that he describes it as, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." And he asks Peter and James and John to stay awake and to pray with him. And so then he goes on a little further and he prays alone. And the contents of the prayer in Mark, Mark gives kind of the shortest version of it. It says, Abba, Father. Abba, by the way, is the Aramaic word it's an Aramaic word for Father. And it kind of lies somewhere in the formality spectrum between, if you say Father in English, that's a pretty formal, detached way of saying Father. But then there's also Daddy or Dad, a much more familiar, intimate term of address. Abba was somewhere between those kind of poles of formality. It was kind of a kind of halfway point between father and daddy. And so it's a familiar term of address that Jesus is using when he's praying. He says, Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And so Jesus is praying this prayer, and he says, take this cup from me. And he's using a, for the time, fairly familiar, fairly common metaphor of whatever is about to happen to you, whatever's in front of you, whatever trial or situation or blessing is about to happen to you, is a cup full of a particular vintage or wine that God has given you to drink. And so this, whatever's in front of you, that's the cup that God has given you to drink. That's the cup that God has set in front of you. And so you should drink it, right? And that's kind of the mental image. And so Jesus is using this image and saying, Father, let this cup pass from me. And so what he's asking for is for God to change something so that he doesn't have to suffer what's about to happen. He doesn't have to be arrested and humiliated and tortured publicly and then crucified and killed and then die, so that he doesn't have to go through what the next day is going to bring him. And so he's praying and asking God, let this cup, let this situation pass from me. But then he says, nevertheless, not my will, but yours. Not what I will, but what you will. If you look in Luke chapter 22, you look at the Luke's version of it, or Luke's translation of it, it says, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. And so the idea is Jesus is saying, he's looking at what's about to happen to him, and everything in his being, every human instinct is screaming out, run, no. And so he asks his Father to let him out, if it's God's will, if it's the Father's will, to change the situation and let him not have to suffer what he's about to suffer. But he finishes that prayer with, but not what I will, but what you will. Not what I want, but what you want. If this is your will, I submit, and I'll go through it. And so he prays that, and then he gets up and he goes out and checks on his disciples, and he finds that Peter and James and John have all conked out. They're all asleep. He asks them to stay awake and pray with him, and now they've fallen asleep. He says, he wakes them up and says, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch with me for 1 hour? Couldn't you stay awake for an hour with me? And then he goes back and prays again, and prays the same thing, basically. And then he comes back and he finds the disciples conked out again a second time. And then he looks up, and there's the crowds coming to arrest him. Now, Luke adds in some extra details. If you look at Luke chapter 22, verses 39 through 46, you see that it's the same scene, but Luke adds in an extra detail. It says, after Jesus prays, Father, if you're willing to take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done, Luke adds that an angel comes to comfort him. An angel comes down and comforts him in his grief and his sorrow. And then, being in anguish, Jesus prayed even more earnestly, and his sweat is like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, that could just be a poetic image, but there is actually a medical condition that can cause you to sweat blood. It's called hematidrosis. Hematidrosis, and the word literally means blood, hemat, and sweat, or water, hydrosis, hydro. And so, blood sweat. And it's actually a diagnosable medical condition, and it typically happens in people that are in a situation where there is really deep stress or anguish or fear of upcoming death or loss, destruction. In fact, it is kind of stereotypically seen in soldiers about to head into a battle, or in death row inmates that know that they're about to be executed just prior to their day of execution. And so it's typically in someone that is facing something that is terrifying, an overwhelmingly terrifying situation. And then at some point they get relief. Either the execution is stayed, or the soldier gets new orders that sends them in a different direction, and they won't be in the most dangerous part of the battle. Or either the soldier or the death row inmate or whoever is in this great situation of anguish suddenly comes to a point where they're at peace with their situation. one way or another. And so either they come to accept it and they're at peace with it, or there's an escape from it. And so there's this moment of intense relief. And so what happens is if any of you have taken health classes, you've probably studied the fight or flight response. And part of what happens during the fight or flight response is that the capillaries in your skin constrict down, and that pushes blood away from the outer surface of your skin, which keeps you from bleeding as much if you're cut, and pushes that blood into your internal organs where you're more likely to need it while you're running and trying to get away. And so it pushes more blood into your muscles and other internal organs so that you're more likely to survive whatever's in front of you. And so if you're in a situation of deep anguish, even if it's emotional anguish, your body doesn't know the difference, and so it does fight or flight, and it starts squeezing those capillaries down and squeezing the blood out of your skin. Well, then if a moment of intense relief comes, either you find out that you aren't going to be killed or that you've come to peace with your situation, then that constriction of those capillaries relaxes and blood comes rushing back in. And if there's enough of a switch or contrast, a sharp enough contrast between the two, then the blood that comes rushing into the capillaries in your skin can burst around the sweat glands and cause blood to leak from the capillaries into your sweat glands, and you'll literally sweat blood out of your sweat glands. And that very well may be what's happening to Jesus. He has this moment where he's facing the reality of his upcoming death. He's known it's coming. He's been predicting it for weeks at this point. And yet now it's right on him. It's about to happen, and he is feeling all of the very human emotions of facing his own death. And so he's under this intense anguish, and then Luke records that an angel comes to comfort him. And something about that comfort takes away enough of the stress or causes a sharp enough switch that the blood vessels burst and he begins sweating blood. Well, the prayer, Jesus finishes his prayer, and as I said, the crowd is coming up to arrest him. And so he tells his disciples who are asleep on the ground, tells them to get up. My betrayer has come. And so there at the front of that crowd that's coming to arrest him is Judas Iscariot. And Mark records that Judas had arranged this signal with them beforehand. That this group that's coming to arrest Jesus, the guards among them, he's arranged a signal with them. He says, the man that I give a kiss in greeting, the man that I kiss in greeting, he's the one that you should arrest. He's the one that you should put under guard. That will be Jesus. And so Judas comes up, and Luke 22, 47 through 53 records Judas coming up and greeting Jesus and giving him a kiss. Coming up to him to kiss him. And then Jesus replies to him or asks him, Judas, are you betraying me, betraying the Son of Man, with a kiss? And that's probably the most famous interaction between Jesus and Judas, that Judas betrays Jesus by giving him a kiss. It's this intimate gesture that is actually used to betray Jesus. And so Judas kisses him, and that's the signal to the guards to know who to arrest. And then the disciples kind of figure out what's going on, and both Luke and Matthew and Mark, all the synoptics, record one of the disciples drawing a sword and attacking someone. And Luke specifically records that the disciple attacks the servant of the high priest and cuts his ear off. And then if you look at John is even more specific and says that it was Simon Peter who drew the sword, and the high priest's servant's name was Malchus. Malchus. You don't actually have to know that for the test, but that's his name. And so Simon Peter draws the sword and attacks Malchus, trying to fight off the crowd to rescue Jesus. But Jesus tells him to quit, to stop. And Luke records him grabbing the ear and healing Malchus. He heals the high priest's servant. And then he warns or tells Peter and his disciples, this is from Matthew's account in Matthew 26. It says, those who draw the sword or who live by the sword will die by the sword. And so put your sword away. Those who live by the sword or draw the sword will die by the sword. And then he tells them, do you not think that I could call out and ask my Father, and he would at once send more than 12 legions of angels? And remember, a legion was a Roman military unit of 3,000 to 5,000, depending on what year you're in, what phase of the Roman Empire you're in. And so Jesus is saying that if he asked, God would immediately rescue him with an army of angels. Tens of thousands of angels sent to rescue him if he just asked. And so he says, I could handle this myself if I wanted out of this situation. But in very typical Matthew fashion, he says, if I did, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that say that it must happen this way? And then he goes on once again to look at turns and looks at the crowd, and he says, all week long I have been in the temple. Why are you coming out with sticks and clubs and torches like I was some kind of a bandit, or that I was starting a rebellion? Am I starting an uprising? Did you come out with clubs to take me? I've been sitting in your temple all week long teaching, and none of you has raised a finger against me. But then he finishes, again in Matthew's words, he says, but this has all taken place that the writings of the prophet might be fulfilled. And so once again, Matthew shows that the Old Testament is fulfilled by what Jesus does in order to show that he is the promised Messiah. And then they arrest Jesus and take him off. And in the process, as they're arresting Jesus, all the disciples run away. They flee. They get away. And none of them are arrested alongside Jesus. Now, Mark does record, there's this kind of one extra little detail in Mark's gospel. It says in Mark chapter 14, 51 and 52, there was a young man who was wearing nothing but a linen garment, and he was following Jesus, and when the guards go to seize him to try to arrest him along with Jesus, he escapes, slips out of his garment, and runs away naked. And nothing else ever comes from the story. This character is not referred to again. There's no real evidence in the scripture of who this young man is. And so there's this guy that his clothes get grabbed, and he slips out and runs away naked, and gets out of the garden and escapes. Now there are some kind of theories, or the kind of traditional explanation is that this may be Mark himself, that this may be a very young Mark who hasn't yet, fully become a disciple. He hasn't started traveling as he will later with Paul, or he's not a core disciple or a close disciple of Jesus, but he's there that night for some reason. And so he records this one instance of his interaction with Jesus as he runs away naked. But again, that's something, there's no strong evidence for it. It's just kind of a traditional maybe explanation. So that's the naked man that runs away is in Mark's gospel. And so that Jesus at this point, he's arrested. And now he's going to be taken and tried. And there's going to be several layers of these trials. The first, John records that Jesus is first taken to Annas. And Annas is the previous high priest. He's not the current high priest over Israel, but he's one of the prior high priests, and so he retains the title high priest as a kind of honorary title. In the same way that we call former presidents president, former president, or Mr. President. If you're talking to him, you address him formally. You still call them president, even though they're not the currently serving president. So this Annas is the previous high priest, and he is the one that Jesus appears before first. The guards take him straight to Annas. And Annas starts to ask him questions about his disciples and about what he has been teaching, about the content of his teaching. And Jesus replies and says, basically, I haven't taught anything in private, or I haven't taught anything different in private than I have in public. All of my words are out there for public consumption. You don't have to ask me. You can ask anyone who is listening to me. And one of the officials that's there nearby, someone else that's in the room while Annas is questioning Jesus, takes that as being disrespectful to the high priest, and so he reaches over and slaps Jesus in the face and tells him that he ought to speak. Basically, is this the way you answer the high priest? This is John 18, by the way, 19 through 24. It says, is this the way you answer the high priest? And so Jesus looks back at him and answers and says, if I said something wrong, testify as to what it was. If I said something wrong, tell me what I said. But if I didn't, if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? And the interview with Annas ends, and they take him to Caiaphas. And Caiaphas gathers the Sanhedrin for a trial. And so the entire, this Jewish ruling council gathers at night to put Jesus on trial. And there's several things about this trial that are wrong. They should not have happened. According to Jewish law, according to the traditions of the Sanhedrin, according to the way that they normally conducted trials when they conducted trials, that several things happened over this trial that should not have happened. Among them is that it was at night. Jesus was arrested at night and taken almost directly to the Sanhedrin as soon as some of them could be gathered together to be tried. And there was a rule, a law, that said that the Sanhedrin could not conduct a trial overnight. Because if you conduct a trial overnight, then the defendant, who's just been arrested, doesn't have any opportunity to gather any witnesses in his defense, to gather any support. And so if you hold the trial at night, it limits the ability to gather witnesses. Also, if you hold the trial at night, there's no transparency. A trial is supposed to be able, in general, to be viewed, for people to be able to see what's happening, to make sure that the Sanhedrin is staying honest, right? That they're conducting the trial as well. And if you hold it at night, the public nobody can be there to view it and make sure that everything is done well, done rightly. And so that also the defendant can't get any witnesses or have anyone speak on his behalf. He can't bring in anyone to speak on his behalf in his defense. And also, there should have been someone from the Sanhedrin speaking for Jesus, speaking on his behalf and presenting his defense. And that doesn't happen. So he doesn't have any defense. No one defends him. And this also, having the trial at night, means that not all the members of the Sanhedrin come. Some of them are already in bed asleep. And some of them were probably just not invited. And so not all of the Sanhedrin is there, and this becomes an issue because there are some members of the Sanhedrin that are at least sympathetic to Jesus, including Nicodemus, who we saw back in John chapter 3 with the "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son" verse, John 3:16. And so we'll see when it comes to Jesus' burial, Nicodemus is actually assisting in Jesus' burial because even though he doesn't drop everything and follow Jesus, Nicodemus is sympathetic to Jesus and almost certainly would have spoken on his behalf if he had been present, if he had been there. And so all of that, because they have it at night, none of that can happen. And so this is an illegal trial. This should not be happening. To have this trial at night is unjust. To have no witnesses speaking on his behalf, or to have no opportunity to gather witnesses on his behalf, and have no one speaking in his defense, that makes this an illegal trial. This should not be happening. Also, when they come to present evidence against him, they can't get any two witnesses to actually agree to any charge against him. They can't get two people to say the same thing. They're bringing in these false witnesses that are lying about things that Jesus said or did, and they can't get any two of them to say the same thing. And so they don't have any two witnesses. And that is part of the Old Testament, straight from the Old Testament law, that no one can be put to death except on the testimony of two or more witnesses. You have to have at least two independent sources of evidence, two witnesses against someone, in order to put them on trial to kill them for the death penalty, capital offense. And so there are no agreeing witnesses. And then when they finally do get two that are kind of similar, they don't even then they don't say the same thing. They're not close enough to accuse him with. But when they do say something, it's obviously a twisting of the things that Jesus actually taught, the things that he actually said. The two witnesses come up and say, "We heard this man say that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. That he would destroy this temple made with hands and in 3 days build a new temple that was not made with hands." If you remember back last week on Wednesday before the break, I told you that Jesus, after he cleared out the temple, he was asked by what authority he did this. And part of his answer was to say, if you destroy this temple, then 3 days later I'll build it again. And all the gospel authors are real clear that he was talking about his own body, but the Jewish leaders thought he was talking about the physical temple. And if you listen closely to what Jesus said there, he said, if you destroy the temple, then 3 days later I'll rebuild it. They find witnesses to come and twist what Jesus said, so that the witnesses are saying, he said he would destroy the temple and then 3 days later rebuild it. Jesus never threatened the temple, but that's the closest they can get, is to have these false witnesses come up and twist something that he said. And then, finally, after a long period of questioning, Caiaphas gets fed up, the current high priest gets fed up, and he stands up and he says, tell us plainly. He tells Jesus, speaks to Jesus, says, tell us plainly, are you the Messiah? Now, the thing to note at this point is that Jesus can totally get out of this situation. He can absolutely escape this just by playing out the clock until morning. All he has to do is keep not answering until morning, and he'll be under daylight. This trial will never stand. First of all, they convened it at night, which is illegal. They can't get away with that. Second, other witnesses can come up, and witnesses know exactly what Jesus said, and they can refute this testimony. And there's several things. Witnesses can come up with his defense. Someone else can speak for him. The rest of the Sanhedrin can come in and see what's going on. Lots of things are going to happen when day breaks. And so all Jesus has to do is play out the clock. And instead, he answers and says plainly, yes, I am the Messiah. And then he adds, and you will see the Son of Man riding on the clouds of heaven and seated at God's right hand. And so by saying he's going to be seated at God's right hand, he's claiming authority equal to God's, equal to the Father's, that position of authority at the right hand of the throne. And the clouds of heaven would be the kind of physical representation or physical expression of God's glory, the same clouds that covered the mountaintop at Mount Sinai in Exodus. And so he's saying, you will see me riding with the glory of God, riding on the glory of God, and seated in the place of authority in heaven. And so he's claimed to be equal with God, and so now he said something that they can use to accuse him of blasphemy. He hands them the evidence himself. And so Caiaphas gets up and tears his robe, which is another thing that wasn't supposed to happen. Caiaphas, the high priest, is not supposed to show strong emotion because that can bias the rest of the group. And calls for an immediate vote to condemn him, and the vote is unanimous, which is two more things that are not supposed to happen in a capital offense trial. You can't have the vote or the condemnation come on the same day as the trial. You can't have the trial be all in one day. Everyone should have at least a night to sleep on it. And if there's a unanimous vote, then chances are you're voting out of emotion rather than out of reason, because there ought to be at least one person that thinks that the evidence is insufficient if everybody's just using their reason. And so all of those things make this an unjust and illegal trial. We are out of time and then some, and so we will pick up with the rest of the trials and the crucifixion itself on Wednesday. If you got any questions or if you have not yet picked up your test, please come up and get it from me.